What happens when a man wearing a MAGA hat is arrested in public, only for the officers to realize too late that he's their new chief of police? This is the story of a mistake that sparked a journey of accountability, redemption, and change. The late afternoon sun cast its golden rays over Elmwood Square, a picturesque park nestled in the heart of the small, tight-knit community. Families were scattered across the green. Children played on the swings, and joggers passed by on the gravel paths. The warm, idyllic scene was broken only by the occasional chirp of police radios, carried by officers Daniel Porter and James Wallace, as they conducted their routine patrol. Daniel, a seasoned officer with a decade on the force, strolled along the park's main path with his partner James, who was younger and still finding his footing. Daniel's sharp eyes darted around the park, taking in every detail. He prided himself on being thorough, even in this low-crime neighborhood. "You ever wonder what people think when they see us walking through here?" James asked, his voice casual as he gestured toward the parkgoers. Daniel smirked. "Depends on the person, I guess. Some probably feel safer, others not so much." As they continued their patrol, Daniel's gaze fell on a man sitting alone on a bench near the fountain. The man was middle-aged, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet composure. He wore a red MAGA hat, the bright lettering catching the sunlight. In his hands, he held a thermos, from which he occasionally sipped. A worn leather bag sat by his feet. Daniel felt a flicker of unease. The man wasn't doing anything unusual, but something about him seemed out of place. He nudged James and nodded toward the man. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, his tone low. James squinted at the man. "I don't know. It looks harmless to me." Daniel frowned. "Maybe. But we've had reports of disturbances in the area. People arguing, making others uncomfortable. Could be him." James hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right, let's check it out." The two officers approached the man, their postures relaxed but purposeful. The man looked up as they neared, his expression calm and friendly. "Afternoon, officers," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "Something I can help you with?" Daniel stopped a few feet away, keeping his tone polite but firm. "Good afternoon, sir. We're just making our rounds. Mind if we ask what you're doing here?" The man smiled faintly. "Just enjoying the day. It's a nice park." James gestured to the bag at the man's feet. "What's in the bag?" "Just some work papers," the man replied. "I was reviewing them while I had my coffee." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "We've had some reports of disturbances in the area. Anything you've noticed?" The man shook his head. "No disturbances here, officers. Just a quiet afternoon." "Do you have any identification on you?" Daniel asked, his tone still polite but now tinged with suspicion. The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet disappointment. "Disturbances? I haven't done anything wrong." Daniel's posture stiffened. "It's just a routine check, sir." After a moment's hesitation, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He handed over his driver's license without a word. Daniel studied the license, his brow furrowing. The name David Wright meant nothing to him, and the address was from out of town. He handed the license to James, who looked it over before nodding. "Everything checks out," James said. Daniel's unease didn't subside. "Mind if we take a look in your bag?" he asked, nodding toward it. David's expression hardened. "I'd rather you didn't. It's personal." Daniel exchanged a glance with James, who shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if you've got nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." David sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "This really necessary?" Daniel felt his patience wearing thin. "Sir, we're just trying to do our job. Please stand up." David hesitated, then rose slowly to his feet. His movements were calm, almost resigned, as if he knew what was coming. Daniel pulled out his handcuffs, his tone firm. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." David didn't argue. As Daniel secured the cuffs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this wasn't right. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on protocol. As Daniel and James escorted David toward their patrol car, the atmosphere in the park shifted. Conversations quieted, and heads turned as parkgoers watched the scene unfold. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "What did he do?" The mother shushed her, her gaze lingering on David with a mix of curiosity and concern. David walked with quiet dignity, his gaze straight ahead. He didn't resist or protest, but the weight of his disappointment was palpable. Daniel felt it too, though he wouldn't admit it. James, walking slightly behind, seemed visibly uncomfortable. When they reached the patrol car, Daniel opened the back door and motioned for David to get in. "Watch your head," he said, his tone curt. David climbed in without a word, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. As Daniel closed the door, he felt a flicker of doubt. But again, he pushed it aside. They were just following procedure. The drive to the station was silent, the tension in the car almost suffocating. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, while James stole occasional glances at David through the rearview mirror. The man's calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from the two officers. When they arrived at the station, the usual hum of activity paused as Daniel and James escorted David inside. Officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. It wasn't every day someone in a MAGA hat was brought in for disturbances. Daniel led David to a small interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the bare walls. He motioned for David to sit at the metal table, then secured the cuffs to a loop on the table's edge. "I'll be back in a minute," Daniel said, his voice clipped. David didn't respond. He simply sat there, his calm expression unchanged. A growing unease. Outside the interrogation room, Daniel and James stood by the window, watching David through the glass. "Something's off," James muttered, his voice low. "He's too calm." Daniel frowned. Maybe he's guilty and just good at hiding it. Or maybe he's not guilty at all, James said, his tone sharp. "You ever think about that?" Daniel turned to his partner, his frustration evident. "Look, we've had complaints about disturbances, and he fits the description. We're doing our job." James shook his head. "I just hope we didn't screw this up." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he glanced back at David, who was sitting quietly, his eyes fixed on the table. For the first time, doubt crept into Daniel's mind. But it was too late to turn back now. As Daniel and James debated their actions, Sergeant Miller approached them, his brow furrowed. "Who's the guy?" he asked, nodding toward the interrogation room. "Name's David Wright," Daniel replied. "We brought him in for questioning. Disturbances in the park." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Disturbances? What kind of disturbances?" Daniel hesitated. "People said he was acting suspicious. We thought it was worth checking out." Miller frowned, his gaze shifting to the man in the room. Suddenly, his expression changed, his eyes widening. "Wait a second. That's David, right?" Daniel blinked, confused. "Yeah, why?" Miller's face darkened. "That's the new chief." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His mind raced as the implications sank in. "What? No way. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to," Miller snapped. "He's the chief, and you just arrested him." James paled, his eyes darting to the interrogation room. "What do we do now?" Miller's jaw tightened. "You fix this now." Inside the Elmwood Police Department, tension rippled through the air like a tangible force. Officers moved quietly, their usual camaraderie replaced with whispered questions and uneasy glances. The news that David Wright, the new chief of police, had been mistakenly arrested was spreading rapidly through the station. Some officers peeked through the blinds into the interrogation room, where Wright sat silently, his MAGA hat now resting on the table before him. Sergeant Miller wasted no time. After informing Daniel Porter and James Wallace of their mistake, he marched into the interrogation room, his face a mixture of anger and regret. Daniel and James lingered just outside the door, their hearts pounding as they watched Miller confront the man they had detained. "Chief Wright," Miller began, his tone unusually cautious. "I can't even begin to apologize for this misunderstanding." Wright raised his eyes from the table, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Misunderstanding?" he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's one way to put it." Miller shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, I assure you, this wasn't intentional." Officers Porter and Wallace were responding to reports of disturbances in the park. They were just following protocol. "Protocol," Wright repeated, his gaze steady. "Tell me, Sergeant, what part of protocol involves detaining someone for sitting on a park bench with a coffee and a bag of work documents?" Miller's jaw tightened, and he glanced back at the two officers outside the door. Daniel and James flinched under his glare, but didn't move. Turning back to Wright, Miller took a deep breath. "Sir, I'll have these cuffs removed immediately," he said, stepping forward. As Miller unlocked the handcuffs, Wright flexed his wrists, a faint red mark visible where the metal had pressed against his skin. "Thank you," he said, his tone clipped. But the cuffs aren't the issue here. The issue is judgment or the lack thereof. Outside the interrogation room, Daniel leaned against the wall, his stomach churning. The realization of what he had done was hitting him hard. He replayed the arrest in his mind, the assumptions he had made, the way he had ignored Wright's calm explanations. He thought he'd been doing his job, but now he saw the truth. He had let his biases cloud his judgment. James broke the silence, his voice low. What do we do now? Daniel shook his head, unable to find an answer. For years, he'd prided himself on being a good cop, fair, level-headed, committed to justice. But today, he felt like a failure. After being uncuffed, Wright remained seated, his hands resting on the table. He looked at Miller, then at the window, where he could see Daniel and James watching him. Sergeant, Wright said, his voice steady, bring them in. Miller hesitated. Sir, are you sure? Bring them in, Wright repeated firmly. Miller nodded reluctantly and opened the door. Porter, Wallace, inside. Daniel and James exchanged a nervous glance before stepping into the room. Miller closed the door behind them, leaving the three men alone with Wright. For a long moment, no one spoke. Wright studied the two officers, his gaze sharp but not unkind. Finally, he broke the silence. Sit, he said simply. Daniel and James obeyed, sinking into the chairs across from him. Wright leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. Do you know why I didn't tell you who I was? He asked. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. No, sir, because I wanted to see how you'd treat me, Wright said. Not as the chief, not as someone in a position of authority, just as a man sitting in a park. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We didn't mean. I'm not interested in what you meant. Wright interrupted, his tone calm but firm. I'm interested in what you did. You saw a man in a MAGA hat and assumed he was a problem. You didn't ask the right questions. You didn't use your judgment. You let your biases guide your actions. Daniel felt his face burn with shame. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Wright continued, his gaze never wavering. Do you understand the message that sends? He asked. To the community? To the people we're supposed to serve and protect? If you can make this mistake with me, what's stopping you from making it with someone else? Someone who doesn't have the privilege of my position. The room fell silent, Wright's words hanging heavily in the air. Daniel stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists. He had always believed in the badge and the values it represented. But now, he saw how easily those values could be undermined by carelessness and assumption. Wright leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. I'm not here to ruin your careers, he said, but I am here to hold you accountable. Because if we can't hold ourselves accountable, we have no right to ask for the community's trust. James looked up, his voice trembling. What can we do to fix this? You start by acknowledging your mistake, Wright said, publicly, not just to me, but to your colleagues and to the community. And then you commit to doing better not just today, but every day. Later that afternoon, the entire department was called into the main briefing room. The air was thick with tension as officers filed in, their murmurs filling the space. At the front of the room, Wright stood with Miller, Daniel, and James by his side. The two officers looked pale, their postures stiff as they prepared to address their colleagues. Wright raised a hand, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming, he began. As many of you know, there was an incident earlier today involving myself and Officers Porter and Wallace. It's an incident that highlights an issue we must address not just as a department, but as individuals. He stepped aside, motioning for Daniel to step forward. The officer took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he approached the podium. I made a mistake, Daniel began, his voice strained. I acted on assumptions instead of evidence. I let my biases guide my actions, and in doing so, I failed to uphold the values this badge represents. For that, I'm deeply sorry. James followed, his voice quieter but no less sincere. We know that words aren't enough, he said. That's why we're committed to learning from this, to becoming better officers and better people. The room was silent for a moment before Wright stepped forward again. Accountability isn't easy, he said, but it's necessary. This department has the potential to be a force for good in this community, but only if we're willing to confront our mistakes and grow from them. Word of the incident and the public apology spread quickly through Elmwood. At first, the community's response was mixed. Some residents were outraged, demanding Daniel and James be fired. Others saw their willingness to take responsibility as a step in the right direction. At a town hall meeting that evening, Wright addressed the community directly. "Mistakes were made," he said, "but mistakes are also opportunities for growth. As your chief, I promise you this, we will not sweep this under the rug. We will learn from it, and we will do better." The Elmwood Police Department buzzed with uneasy energy. The events of the past day had thrown the officers into uncharted territory, and everyone seemed to be waiting for what came next. Officer Daniel Porter and his partner James Wallace stood in the locker room, their expressions weighed down by the knowledge of their mistake. The words "new chief" had echoed in Daniel's mind all night, keeping him from sleep. James sat on the bench, staring at his shoes, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. "We messed up, man," James muttered, breaking the silence. "Big time." Daniel didn't respond. He was staring at the neatly folded uniform shirt in his locker, the badge sewn onto it a symbol of trust, justice, and authority. But after yesterday, it felt like nothing more than an empty emblem. "What do we do now?" James asked, his voice quieter, almost pleading. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We own it. We don't run from this. We can't." Meanwhile, Chief David Wright was in his newly assigned office, a modest space with sparse decor. Despite his composed demeanor, the events of the previous day lingered in his mind. He couldn't let this mistake fester. It wasn't just about him. It was about a department that needed change, about officers who needed to see the consequences of their actions, and about a community that deserved better. Sergeant Miller knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. "Chief," he said, his tone respectful but hesitant, "the department's been buzzing. People are asking questions." "They should be," Wright replied, his voice calm but resolute. "This is a teachable moment, Sergeant, for everyone." Miller nodded, his jaw tightening. "What's the plan?" Wright leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "We're going to address this head-on. There's no room for hiding or downplaying what happened. If we want to rebuild trust internally and externally, we need to start with transparency." That afternoon, Wright called a department-wide meeting. Every officer was instructed to attend, from rookies to veterans. The briefing room filled quickly, the chatter subdued and tense. Daniel and James sat near the back, their shoulders hunched as they avoided the gazes of their colleagues. Wright stood at the front, his presence commanding but approachable. "Thank you all for coming," Wright began, his voice steady as he scanned the room. "I won't sugarcoat this. Yesterday, a mistake was made. 2 of our officers detained me, under assumptions that had no basis in evidence or behavior. And while I was the one affected, this isn't just about me. This is about us as a department and how we move forward." The room was silent, every officer hanging on his words. Officers Porter and Wallace will speak for themselves shortly. Wright continued, his gaze flicking briefly to the 2 men. "But before they do, I want to make one thing clear. Accountability is not a punishment. It's an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to do better. And that starts now." He nodded to Daniel and James, motioning them to come forward. The walk to the front of the room felt like miles, every step heavy with dread. When they reached the podium, Daniel cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he began. I want to apologize," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "to Chief Wright, to this department, and to this community. Yesterday, I let my assumptions guide my actions. I didn't ask the right questions, and I didn't listen. And because of that, I failed." James followed, his voice quieter but no less sincere. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said, "but I want you all to know that I'm committed to learning from this, to becoming a better officer and a better person." The room was silent for a moment before Wright stepped forward again. "Thank you, Officers Porter and Wallace," he said. "Your willingness to take responsibility is a good start. But now, we need to back those words with action." Wright wasted no time in rolling out new initiatives. The first was mandatory training on bias recognition and de-escalation, a program designed to help officers examine their assumptions and approach situations with greater understanding and fairness. Every member of the department, from rookies to senior officers, was required to participate. Daniel and James were the first to attend. The training sessions were intense, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their biases. One exercise involved role-playing scenarios, where assumptions could lead to dangerous consequences. Another focused on listening and communication, skills that Daniel realized he had neglected in his years on the force. After one particularly challenging session, Daniel found himself sitting outside the training facility, his head in his hands. James joined him, sitting silently for a moment before speaking. "This isn't easy," James said, his voice quiet. "It's not supposed to be," Daniel replied, his tone grim. "But it's necessary." The training was only the first step. Wright knew that rebuilding trust with the community required more than internal changes. It required outreach, transparency, and genuine connection. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to share their concerns and ask questions directly. The community center was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Wright stood at the front, flanked by Daniel and James, who looked visibly nervous. As residents took turns speaking, their emotions ranged from anger to hope. "I was furious when I heard what happened," one woman said, her voice trembling. "How can we trust a department that makes mistakes like this?" Wright nodded, his expression empathetic. "Your anger is justified," he said, "and that's why we're here, not to make excuses, but to take responsibility and to listen. This department is committed to earning back your trust, one step at a time." When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he felt his chest tighten, but he stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "I know I let you down," he said, "and I know it'll take more than words to make this right. But I promise you, I'm committed to doing better for you, for this department, and for myself." The turning point came a few weeks later, during a routine patrol. Daniel and James were called to a local coffee shop, where a man was reportedly acting suspiciously. As they approached, Daniel felt a flicker of unease, a reminder of the mistake that had changed everything. But this time, he paused. He approached the man calmly, introduced himself, and asked open-ended questions. The man, a college professor grading papers, explained his presence easily. Daniel apologized for the interruption and left, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. Back at the station, Wright called him into his office. "I heard about the coffee shop," Wright said, his expression thoughtful. Daniel nodded. "Just doing my job." "No," Wright said, his voice firm. "You're doing it right." As the weeks turned into months, the changes Wright had implemented began to take root. The department grew closer, its officers more thoughtful and deliberate in their actions. Community members noticed the difference, their trust slowly rebuilding. For Daniel and James, the journey was far from over, but they embraced it, determined to prove that their mistake didn't define them. With every interaction, every decision, they carried the lessons they had learned, striving to live up to the values they had once taken for granted. One evening, as Daniel drove through the quiet streets of Elmwood, he spotted a man sitting on a park bench, wearing a MAGA hat. The sight gave him pause, but instead of assuming, he smiled and waved. The man waved back, and Daniel continued on his way, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The atmosphere inside the Elmwood Police Department had shifted. The arrest of their new chief had thrown everyone into a state of unease. Conversations were hushed, and officers avoided prolonged eye contact with each other. Officers Daniel Porter and James Wallace were at the center of it all, their every move scrutinized. The weight of their actions was inescapable, and they knew they couldn't undo the damage, but they could face it head-on. Chief David Wright sat in his office, his fingers steepled as he reviewed the aftermath of the incident. The ripple effects of his wrongful arrest were felt far beyond the department. Community leaders had reached out, voicing their concerns, and the media had begun to circulate stories about the arrest. Wright was a patient man, but he understood the urgency of the situation. Change had to happen now. Sergeant Miller entered the room, his face tense. "Chief, we've got the agenda for the town hall tonight. Do you want me to go over it?" Wright looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "No need, Sergeant. I'll handle this one." Miller hesitated. "Are you sure, sir?" "The community is angry." "They should be," Wright said firmly. "And so should we. Anger isn't the enemy here, it's complacency." In the briefing room, Daniel and James sat at the back, their usual spots now feeling like the hottest seats in the department. The other officers gave them a wide berth, their gazes flickering between pity and judgment. Daniel felt the knot in his stomach tighten as Wright entered the room. The quiet chatter instantly silenced. "Officers," Wright began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and purpose. "Let's get one thing clear. What happened to me should never have happened to anyone. And I say anyone because this is about more than a single mistake. It's about a culture. It's about the way we see the people we serve and the way we see each other. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Daniel and James, officers Porter and Wallace. Made a mistake, and they're owning up to it. But this isn't just their failure, it's ours as a department. We allowed complacency to creep into our work, and that ends today. Wright paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. We're starting with mandatory training, but that's just the beginning. We're going to rebuild trust not just with the community, but with each other. And it starts now. The Elmwood Community Center was packed that evening. The energy in the room charged with a mix of anger, curiosity, and hope. Residents filled the folding chairs, their voices a low murmur as they waited for the event to begin. At the front of the room, a long table with microphones was set up for Wright and his officers. Daniel and James stood off to the side, their nerves palpable. "This is going to be brutal," James muttered, tugging at the collar of his uniform. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "Good, it should be." When Wright took the podium, the room fell silent. He stood tall, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I know many of you are angry, and you have every right to be. I'm here to listen to you and to answer for what happened." He explained the events of his arrest in plain terms, sparing no detail. He didn't sugarcoat the mistakes that were made, nor did he shift the blame. When he was finished, he opened the floor to questions. A man in the second row stood up, his arms crossed. "Chief Wright, with all due respect, how can we trust a department that can't even recognize its own chief?" Wright nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a fair question," he said. "The answer is that trust isn't something you're given. It's something you earn. And we're going to earn it by being transparent, by holding ourselves accountable, and by making meaningful changes." A woman near the back raised her hand. "What about the officers who arrested you? Are they being fired?" Daniel felt his stomach drop as Wright glanced in his direction. "No," Wright said firmly. "Firing them would be the easy way out. Instead, they're facing their mistake head-on. They've undergone training. They've apologized publicly. And they're committed to earning back your trust. That's how real change happens." As the meeting progressed, the tone in the room began to shift. Residents who had come in angry started to see Wright's vision for change. They appreciated his honesty and his willingness to take action. By the end of the evening, the applause was genuine, if not unanimous. Back at the station, Daniel and James sat in the locker room, the events of the day playing over in their minds. "That was intense," James said, exhaling deeply. Daniel nodded, but it was necessary. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you think people will ever trust us again?" Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. "I don't know, but I'm going to spend every day trying to earn it." The following weeks were transformative. Wright's mandatory training sessions pushed the officers to confront their biases, their assumptions, and their habits. Daniel found himself thinking deeply about the way he approached his work, questioning actions he had once taken for granted. It was uncomfortable, but it was also eye-opening. One day, during a training exercise, Daniel was paired with Wright. The exercise involved role-playing a traffic stop, with Wright acting as a civilian. As they went through the scenario, Wright paused and looked at Daniel. "What's the most important thing you've learned from this?" Wright asked. Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "To listen. To not assume I know someone's story before they tell it." Wright smiled faintly. "Good, remember that." The true test came during a routine patrol a month later. Daniel and James were called to investigate a report of suspicious activity at a local convenience store. When they arrived, they found a young man in a hoodie pacing outside, his hands stuffed in his pockets. In the past, Daniel might have approached the situation with suspicion, but this time, he took a different approach. He introduced himself calmly, asked open-ended questions, and listened. It turned out the young man was waiting for a ride and felt uncomfortable going inside the store because he didn't have enough money to make a purchase. As they drove away, James glanced at Daniel. "You handled that well," he said. Daniel shrugged. "It's how we should have been handling things all along." That evening, Daniel sat in his car outside his house, the engine off. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time, not just in the department, but in himself. He had always seen himself as a good cop, but now he realized that being good wasn't enough. He needed to be better. He looked down at the badge on his chest, the metal catching the faint glow of a street lamp. For the first time in weeks, it felt like it meant something again. The Elmwood Police Department had seen its fair share of trials in recent weeks. The arrest of Chief David Wright had shaken its foundation, forcing everyone, officers and community members alike, to reflect on their assumptions and biases. But the mistakes made had also sparked an unprecedented transformation. For officers Daniel Porter and James Wallace, the path to redemption was still underway, but progress was being made. It was a crisp morning when Chief Wright called another department-wide meeting, this time in the large training hall. Rows of officers filled the space, their faces a mix of anticipation and curiosity. Daniel and James sat together near the front, their posture straight and attentive. Both men had thrown themselves into the mandatory training programs Wright had implemented, but the weight of their mistakes still lingered. Wright stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding but approachable. The room quieted as he began to speak. "Good morning, everyone," Wright started, his deep voice carrying through the hall. "It's been a challenging few weeks, but it's also been a time of growth for this department, for this community, and for me." He paused, letting his words settle. "When I walked into this role, I didn't expect my first encounter with our officers to be as a suspect. That moment, while painful, revealed a truth we can't ignore. The work we do here is not just about enforcing the law. It's about serving people fairly, justly, and without bias." He turned his gaze to Daniel and James, who met his eyes with steady resolve. "Today, we close a chapter on what happened, but we also open a new one where we hold ourselves to a higher standard, where we rebuild trust, and where we prove to this community that we're worthy of the badge." Later that afternoon, the department hosted a community engagement event in Elmwood Square, the same park where Wright's arrest had taken place. Booths lined the pathways, staffed by officers sharing information about safety programs and answering residents' questions. It was a deliberate effort to bridge the gap between the department and the people it served. Daniel and James were assigned to a table labeled "Ask an Officer." As residents approached, their initial interactions were cautious, but the officers' open demeanor slowly eased the tension. One woman, clutching a toddler on her hip, stopped in front of the table. Her expression was unreadable as she looked at Daniel. "You're one of the officers who arrested the chief, aren't you?" Daniel nodded, his face serious. "Yes, ma'am, that was me." She studied him for a moment before speaking. "That was a big mistake." "It was," Daniel admitted, "and I'm sorry for it. I let my assumptions get the better of me, but I'm doing everything I can to make it right." The woman's gaze softened slightly. "Good, because we need officers we can trust." As the event continued, Daniel noticed a teenage boy lingering near one of the booths. The boy was wearing a hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He seemed hesitant, as if debating whether to approach. Daniel stepped away from the table and walked over to him, keeping his tone friendly. "Hey there," he said. "Can I help you with something?" The boy looked up, startled, but relaxed when he saw Daniel's approachable demeanor. I was just looking," he said. "Looking's good," Daniel replied with a smile. "But if you've got questions, I'm here." The boy hesitated before speaking. "How do you become a cop?" Daniel raised his eyebrows, surprised by the question. "Well, it starts with wanting to help people," he said. "The rest is training, hard work, and a commitment to doing the right thing even when it's hard." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "Cool," he said before walking away. Daniel watched him go, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Moments like this reminded him why he joined the force in the first place. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Daniel and James found themselves standing at the edge of the park, watching the event wind down. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the playground. "That kid," James said, nodding toward the boy Daniel had spoken to. "You think he'll actually follow through?" "Maybe," Daniel replied. "But even if he doesn't, at least he knows we're not the bad guys. At least, not anymore." James was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Do you think we'll ever really make up for what happened?" Daniel turned to his partner, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know if we can ever erase it," he said. "But we can let it shape us into better people, better officers. That's all we can do." That evening, Chief Wright called Daniel into his office. The room was quiet, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Wright gestured for Daniel to sit, his expression unreadable. "You've come a long way," Wright said after a moment of silence. "But I need to know, what have you learned from all this?" Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've learned that being a good officer isn't just about following the rules," he said. "It's about listening, about treating every person with respect, no matter what they look like or what they're wearing. It's about owning up to your mistakes and doing the work to fix them." Wright nodded, his gaze steady. "Good, because that's the kind of officer I want in my department. Someone who's not afraid to learn, to grow, and to hold themselves accountable." "Thank you, sir," Daniel said quietly, "for giving me the chance to prove myself." Wright's lips curved into a faint smile. "Don't thank me yet. The real work is just beginning." In the months that followed, the changes Wright had implemented began to take root. The mandatory training sessions continued, but they were no longer seen as a punishment. Instead, they became an opportunity for growth, a chance for officers to reflect on their actions and build stronger relationships with the community. Daniel and James worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust they had lost. They volunteered for community events, took on extra shifts, and made a point of connecting with residents during their patrols. Slowly but surely, the community began to see them in a new light. One evening, as Daniel walked his beat, he passed the boy from the park. The boy was sitting on a bench, flipping through a pamphlet about police careers. When he saw Daniel, he waved, a shy smile on his face. Daniel waved back, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. He still had a long way to go, but moments like this reminded him why the journey was worth it. 1 year after the incident, Wright stood in the department's briefing room, addressing his officers. The air was lighter now, the tension replaced with a sense of unity and determination. "We've come a long way," Wright said, his voice filled with pride. "But the work doesn't stop here. We've proven that we can learn from our mistakes, that we can grow, and that we can earn the trust of the people we serve. Now, it's time to build on that foundation." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Thank you for your dedication, for your willingness to change, and for your commitment to this community. Together, we're stronger than we've ever been." As the officers applauded, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The past year had been hard, but it had also been transformative. He had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about using it to create a better future. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly worthy of the badge he wore.